of dollars that went into Gaza were largely used by Hamas leaders to enrich themselves, to build an incredibly elaborate terrorist infrastructure throughout Gaza. The misconception was Hamas leadership were happy with just being corrupt.
The terrible hand of Iran is behind Hamas and Hezbollah. Iran has absolutely no compunctions about sacrificing every single Palestinian to the cause. What possible response could Israel have except to roll over and submit?
That's not an option. An army that fights by the laws of war, which the IDF does, the civilized army seeks to minimize the civilian casualties. When an army like that encounters an army that not just desires death for its enemy, but desires death for the people it purports to govern, this thing of the ecstasy in bringing death, it's a death cult, a cult that...
Hey everybody, so I'm talking today to Douglas Murray, who just wrote this book on democracies and death cults, Israel and the future of civilization. That's this. We basically walk through the book chapter by chapter. It's a relatively short book, although it doesn't lack in intensity. What happened October 7th when Hamas invaded Israel? What I saw, Douglas's account of his sojourn through Israel in the aftermath of the catastrophe, how the world turned. We discussed the protests, primarily originating on university campuses, much to their eternal shame. The disconnect, the fact that the propaganda exercise and what would you say, the zeitgeist of the West was such so that Israel was demonized almost immediately after the attack for daring to defend itself. And then Douglas's conclusion, from defeat into victory. Well, that's where the conversation got a little bit more theological, possibly, and inevitability when talking about the existence of good and evil. We discussed Douglas's observations that the Israelis have been very successful at pushing forward a truly pro-life, pro-abundance ethos, and the consequence for their thriving, for their resilience in the face of really insuperable opposition, and the meaning of that for hope, not only in Israel, but in the West in general, and a hope we most desperately need in these strangest of all times. Join us for that. So, Mr. Murray, I read your book on democracies and death cults, Israel and the Future of Civilization. Yeah, it's a pretty rough read in like 5 different dimensions. It's brutal and unnerving and like terribly relevant, and not merely because of the situation in Israel. So I think what we should do first is I'm going to ask you questions about each chapter. It's a short book. There's 5 chapters. It starts with what happened. And there's questions everyone has. How did the Israeli security forces miss this? How could something like this happen? What did happen? Who was responsible? So let's start by laying that out. What happened on October 7th?
What happened was that about 4,000 or more terrorists invaded Israel in the early morning. The Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and other jihadist groups in Gaza started firing hundreds and hundreds of rockets at about 6:30 in the morning, almost exactly 6:30 in the morning. So air raid sirens went off across the country. But then something, and sadly that's kind of usual in Israel. It's quite common to have air raid sirens, particularly in the south, has been for 20 years. What became clear was very unusual was that across multiple parts of the Gaza-Israel border, thousands of terrorists broke in. They broke down the fences, they went to the checkpoints where Gazan workers would come through each day and where this occurred. They went to those crossings as well. They filmed them in quite a lot of places. It was a religious holiday. It's Simchat Torah, and so a lot of people were at home with their families. It was 50 years today since the Yom Kippur War, when Israel's Arab neighbors invaded in a surprise attack as well. So you might say, well, how come it's a surprise? That was one of the things, as soon as I got to Israel straight after the 7th, one of the things I was trying to find out was what the hell went wrong. Because the Israelis have always had, certainly since 1973, a sort of invulnerability. It's not true, of course, but they were seen to be invulnerable by many of their neighbors. Certainly
Impossible to catch by surprise.
Impossible to catch by surprise. It's what I call the Fowlerization of Israel, the sort of idea that it's the eyes in the sky everywhere, nothing that can be done that could surprise them. And that wasn't the case. Massive amounts of the security apparatus of Israel failed. Hamas was also very, very clever. They'd done a lot of reconnaissance using, sadly, Gazan workers in Israel to do the reconnaissance, it has to be said, in the months and years ahead of the 7th. They knew how to take down things like communications. They knew how to take down the security apparatus at the border. And by the time that hundreds and then thousands of people were flooding into Israel, invading, they were going community by community through the south, village by village. They're called kibbutz. They're small communities of sometimes a few hundred, sometimes 1,000 people. And these were peaceful communities, farming communities, and they started to go house by house through these communities, massacring the people inside, kidnapping as well. They came across, of course, because they managed to do the invasion not just by land, but by sea and also by air in hang gliders. They managed to come into the dance party, the Nova Party, where thousands of young people were dancing in the early morning. And there's a debate about whether or not the terrorists knew that they were going to get this really easy pickings of unarmed young people dancing in the morning. But whether it was luck or design, they managed to get to the party and came in on military jeeps and trucks and motorcycles and started massacring their way through the young people in the early hours of the morning. There were a lot of questions I asked about what went wrong on the Israeli side. There's a lot to find out about, and some of the answers I think I've come to. But although many people in their homes who I spoke to in the hospitals and in the communities in the aftermath of the 7th said the same thing to me, the thing they said was that they told their children as they were hiding in the bomb shelters, as their homes were on fire and they could hear people at the door trying to break in. They said that they told their children, don't worry, the army will be here in moments. And it wasn't. But it didn't fail entirely. There was some army in the area who put up a very good fight. And some of the army managed to get down fast. Some elite units managed to get to the south swiftly, had very, very intense firefights. But one of the other things that happened was that there were a lot of people who I described, Arab, Druze, Jews, Israelis, who were what I call self-starters, just people who realized that everything was going wrong. The country had been invaded. It was war. And who, through some extraordinary mettle or insight or whatever, sometimes just information, somebody who happened to know somebody in one of the communities in the south who was saying, we're on fire, would just hurtle to the scene and save lives. And that's why I say that the morning of 7th was a story of catastrophic evil from Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and indeed the Gazan civilians who came in to join in the raping and the stealing and the kidnapping. By the end of the day, 1,200 Israelis were dead, many, many more injured, and 250 taken hostage into Gaza. By proportion of population, if people were to extrapolate that out to America, it would be about 44,000 Americans killed in one day.
Well, the hostage situation is also...
And 10,000 Americans taken hostage.
Correct.
That's by proportion of population, if you extrapolate it. It would be 10,000 Americans being dragged out of their homes and taken into enemy territory by terrorists. But the story was, first of all, of the evils that Hamas committed that day. Secondly, and the suffering that they imposed. Secondly, of course, the failure of much of the security apparatus in Israel. from which lessons will have to be learned, and not just by Israel, but by her allies. But thirdly, as I say, it's also the story of extraordinary people rising to this terrible moment and doing unbelievably heroic things. I tell a lot of the stories of people. For instance, there's somebody who's become a friend called Nimrod, who hurtled south in his car. He had been in the army, was called back to base by his commander, but by that point Nimrod was driving south, and he managed to pick up a gun on the way, a single revolver with, I think, 8 rounds of ammunition. Went through every military checkpoint, and just, he said he didn't see a live Israeli till the early afternoon. But when he did, he fought and killed many terrorists. There are other people, like there was a young man at the party I mentioned in the book, whose girlfriend I met, who had realized the situation, managed to get a car out of the party. The terrorists were massacring everyone as they came out by car. So they were shooting the cars, so then there was a log jam. But this young man managed to find a way out on another route. And he took 4 or 5 young people in the car, drove them 30 minutes, dropped them off, came back, took another car full of young people, drove again, took them back. Every time they said to him, "Don't go back again, it's hell, it's death." But he kept doing it. And then the last time he did it, he was killed. Jesus. But there are lots of terrible stories from the day that I recount. But as I say, it also seems to me to be important to credit the people who survived and who didn't, who showed unbelievable heroism.
It didn't really surprise me, I suppose, that there were security lapses. I mean, if you're dealing with an enemy that's absolutely committed, the probability that over some long span of time they're going to find a way through your defenses, how is that not 100%? If everything isn't locked down and there's any semblance of freedom whatsoever.
Yeah.
So the explanation you offered about the mythical status of Israeli invulnerability seems to me to be the most effective explanation.
One thing which was military and other political leaders. It's a very interesting. It was a belief in some of the security infrastructure in Israel that Hamas were effectively like so many terrorist and radical movements throughout history, that they had been misgoverning the Gaza effectively since Israel withdrew in 2005, that they'd stolen billions of dollars of international aid.
Yeah.
All the leaders of Hamas were billionaires, thanks to the Canadian, American, European, British taxpayers.
Seriously.
Well done for us.
Yeah, that's for sure. Really quite something.
Taxpayer funds. The billions of dollars that went into Gaza were largely used by Hamas leaders to enrich themselves, to build an incredibly elaborate terrorist infrastructure throughout Gaza, miles and miles of underground tunnels, very, very elaborate systems, some effectively crawl spaces, others large enough to drive military vehicles from one end of Gaza. And they built that whole infrastructure over the 18 years or so that they governed Gaza. And that was the other way in which they used their money. But the conception, which turned out to be a misconception, was that part of the security apparatus in Israel believed that Hamas leadership were happy with just being corrupt. They were living in luxury, penthouses.
Corrupt was sufficient malevolence.
Rather like the Soviet Union and by the 80s, the leaders didn't believe it anymore. They just wanted to drink, have whatever they could in the time they had.
Right.
And
hedonistic materialism trumps fanatical malevolence.
And of course,
that's quite the theory.
Yeah, and many times in history that has turned out to be true. A lot of revolutionary movements have done that. But this turned out to be completely wrong in the case of the Hamas leadership. They wanted to enrich themselves, and they wanted to do what they said they were going to do, which was annihilate the Jews. And if you look...
Why not have both?
They managed to try and have both. But if you look at, for instance, one of the central figures of the book, Yahya Sinwar, one of the leaders of Hamas who'd been in an Israeli jail until 2011 for killing Palestinians with his own hands, literally throttling them with his own hands and with a kafir.
He's the one who had such a remarkable obituary in the New York Times, if I remember correctly.
One of many. Yahya Sinwar was a true psychopath. And I'd known about him for years. A lot of people who studied the region had. He was what would be called a true believer. After he'd been released in a prisoner exchange for one Israeli soldier who they'd kidnapped in the late 2000s, after Sinwar was exchanged, and by the way, having had his life saved by an Israeli doctor in prison, Sinwar went back to Gaza, seized back control of Hamas, said repeatedly in public statements that he wanted Hamas to go into Israel and tear the hearts out of the bodies of the Jews. On the 7th, he took his best shot at it, and it turned out that what Sinwar said he wanted to do, he did.
There is nothing you'll do in life that's more challenging.
He did.
It's very common for people who are extremely malevolent to tell you exactly what they're going to do and then do it.
Yes.
Far more common than people think. And the fact that people are blind to that reality points to something that we'll have to discuss in more detail. This insistence by naive people in the West that no such thing as malevolence exists, right? All perpetrators are victims until proven otherwise.
Victims we haven't understood yet, or they may have had a bad childhood.
Well, no doubt they did, but there's plenty of people who've had bad childhoods who don't turn into malevolent psychopaths.
That's my observation.
Yes, it's definitely the case. Let's delve a little bit deeper into what happened. I want to lay some propositions before you. When October 7th made its presence known, the first thing that occurred to me, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, if I have some misapprehension, the terrible hand of Iran is behind Hamas and Hezbollah. Iran has absolutely no compunctions about sacrificing every single Palestinian to the cause in as brutal a fashion as possible to capitalize on the public relations scandal that can be made of that. They've got no feeling whatsoever for the Palestinians. They're pure cannon fodder in the eternal war against the great Satan and Israel, right? The US and Israel. That seems appropriate?
Absolutely.
Okay, so what the hell? I went to Oxford, and the first bloody thing that those half-wits asked me when I was on stage was if I was happy about this tweet I made on October 8th, which was, "Give them hell, Netanyahu," which I paid quite the price for, let me tell you. And although not so much a price as many people have paid, put it that way. And so what's Israel to do when they're faced with a disposable people, so to speak, that will be sacrificed at a moment's notice by their own leadership, by their own corrupt philosophy, and by the mullahs of Iran? What possible response could Israel have except to roll over and submit?
Well, a lot of people would like them to do that, of course, but that's not an option. There's a famous story that Joe Biden tells. It's actually a good story for Joe Biden. Being Joe Biden, he's told it a lot. But he when he was a young senator, he once, Golda Meir, former Prime Minister of Israel, indeed the Prime Minister during '73, and she famously said to Joe Biden when she was showing him around, you forget, Senator Biden, we have a secret weapon. And Biden thought that Golda Meir was going to tell him about Israel's nuclear project. And he was all ears. And he said, "What's your secret weapon?" She said, "We have nowhere else to go." So anyone who thinks that rolling over is a possibility for Israel is simply somebody who wants them to be gone. What is clever about Hamas and its backers in Iran, the Iranian revolutionary government, is that they know exactly how to put Israel in an even more intolerable situation each time they attack. So, for instance, they know that if you kidnap Israelis, one of the absolutely central things of the fabric of Israeli society, as with most Western societies, is you don't allow your citizens to remain behind, just like you don't leave your soldiers behind. That if you fall behind enemy lines, if you are taken behind enemy lines, the state will do everything it can to get you back. And that has been a compact in Israel since the foundation in 48, and a really central thing. So Hamas knew, and I have lots of testimony from people who, for instance, overheard terrorists on the morning as they were lying dead or other things, heard the terrorists at, for instance, the Nova Party debating which of the young girls they should shoot and which they should kidnap. And, you know, there were debates that they might have had too many people, too many girls to take back, for instance. But Hamas did the kidnapping knowing that to have 250 Israelis in captivity is to have an unbelievable advantage over the Israelis, because they're going to have to come in. They're going to try to save them. They're going to try to rescue them.
They'll exchange hundreds of terrorists for single Israelis.
As happened recently, an exchange of Palestinian prisoners in jails for committing acts of terrorism, preparing suicide vests, trying to carry out bombings and much more, knife attacks. They will exchange sometimes hundreds of those Palestinians for, as happened the other week, the coffins of 2 Jewish babies. So,
well, one of the things that's striking about your book is your continued explication of the Hamas and Hezbollah terrorists, psychopaths, their willingness to exploit every element of human decency to wage the most destructive possible of wars.
yes,
Right? And so the tunnels, let's go into that for a minute. So Gaza is 11 by 11 miles, approximately 140 square miles, 350 miles of tunnels, right? Longer than the London Underground, which is a stunning
yes,
fact. Stunning fact.
longer than the London Underground, and as I joked to the British military friend, rather better run.
6,000 entrances, many of them in the bedrooms of children.
Oh, almost always where the tunnel entrances come up, they come up in children's bedrooms, in houses throughout Gaza. They come up inside mosques, well, they come up inside hospitals. Even in 2014, the BBC acknowledged that the Hamas leadership were coming up from tunnels underneath the Shifa hospital, which is one of their command headquarters. By the way, all of that is, for anyone who cares about this, completely against every law of war. The Geneva Conventions, every convention of war is, you are not allowed to fight. You're not meant to fight in civilian clothing. You're not meant to fight and fire from places of worship. You're not meant to stockpile ammunition in hospitals. You're not meant to make civilian homes targets, for reasons that our species thought we all understood.
Sufficiently victimized perpetrators have no reason to abide by any standards.
No, of course,
for an argument.
And of course, militarily, this is all Hamas's enormous advantage, because again, they know that if there is a stockpile of ammunition or a terrorist in a tunnel entrance or whatever in a civilian home, and even if the Israelis tell all the locals to get out, the world's media will say that Israel bombed or invaded a civilian home.
Or a hospital or a place of worship.
As a member of the Israeli...
None of those words have the same meaning
none of them.
in Gaza that they do in the West.
None at all. It's whenever it's reported that, that a hospital has been hit, it's usually reported in the world's press, as Hamas wants, that the Israelis just decided to bomb a hospital, as if they're so evil, these Israelis, that they even bomb hospitals. There was a member of the Israeli War Cabinet, Gadi Eisenberg. He lost his son fighting in Gaza in the aftermath of October the 7th, and the next day he lost his nephew, also fighting in Gaza. His nephew was killed because, as the Israelis were trying to do this incredibly delicate military operation to not to get back the hostages, destroy the leadership of Hamas, and minimize any possible civilian casualties. Gary Eisenkot's nephew was fired upon from a mosque by Hamas terrorists who gleefully opened fire on him and his unit. And they were meant to be sticking to the... Hamas were doing that. The Israelis were trying to stick to the normal laws of conflict and not just destroy the mosque. And so they lost soldiers. This is another example of the way in which Hamas do this. Any normal society that valued the life of their own civilians often do what the Israelis did in the south and indeed across much of the country, which is you build bomb shelters in every home. And you have bomb shelters in every civilian area. And across the south of Israel, that's the case, as it is in the north, because it's been being shelled by Hezbollah for 20 years. But only in Gaza do you get a situation where, and I quote one of the Hamas leaders saying this in an interview with Al Arabiya last year, this Hamas leader was asked by a friendly Arab journalist, why, if you say the civilian casualties in Gaza are so high, why can't you allow the civilians of Gaza to shelter in your tunnel networks that you've built underneath Gaza? And the Hamas leader says, but the tunnel system is not for the civilians. The tunnel system is for our fighters and for our weaponry. And the interviewer says, well, who's to look after the civilians? And he says, the international community.
Right. Well, that's just testament to the fact that the Palestinians are essentially cannon fodder for the eternal war against Israel and the United States.
Yes, but it's even worse than that. That of course, an army that fights by the laws of war, which the IDF does, like the American Army, like the British Army, makes mistakes for sure, like the American Army, like the British Army, but that fights by the laws of war. When it encounters a terrorist army like this, the civilized army seeks to minimize the civilian casualties, as the IDF has done, and anyone who claims that it hasn't just does not know what's been going on for the last 18 months.
And believes Hamas reports.
Which
Why would anyone ever believe Hamas reports?
Yeah, it's. I mean, why go to a mass murderer to find out their account of their actions? You know. But the point is that when an army like that encounters an army that not just desires death for its enemy, but desires death for the people it purports to govern, and with a kicker in it, seeks death itself. This is a realm of fanaticism and what I call it's a death cult. Mm-hmm. A cult that literally worships death. The leadership of Hamas, who I quote in the book, have for decades boasted about the extent to which they love death, embrace death. And one of the underlying things in this book, as you know, which we'll come on to doubtless later, but is what happens if a society that actually values life encounters a death cult that worships and glories in death for its foes, but also for itself. And we have
suffering and death.
We have seen such movements throughout history. We have seen them, but most of the world has forgotten about them. And I would argue that Israel, to a great extent, forgot about them until 6:30 in the morning on October 7th, 2023.
Possessed by the spirit of Cain.
Yes.
And that accounts for some of the anti-Semitism too. So let me run something by you. I want to flip to how the world turned. So it is the case that when people develop post-traumatic stress disorder, they relatively rarely develop it in response to a tragedy. Mm-hmm. Even if it's a painful tragedy, they tend to develop it. One risk factor is being naive. Mm-hmm. Seeing the world through rose-colored glasses, let's say, assuming goodwill on everyone's part, including your own, and then encountering a situation, sometimes a situation that you're deeply involved in, where malevolence raises its head. Mm. The West is very sheltered and I would say blind to malevolence, blind to its existence. In the academic realm, there's no discussion of good and evil. Evil is an archaic term, and malevolence is a consequence of trauma, right? A consequence of privation. And that's simply not the case. It's now, I read a book a while back, and I don't remember which one it was, unfortunately, but it described the erasure of the Byzantine Empire from the Western imagination.
Oh, yeah.
I was a relatively old person before I really had any sense at all of the extent of the Byzantine Empire or the catastrophe of its demolition. And the author of this particular book believed that the defeat of the Byzantine Empire by the Islamic world, and maybe by the psychopaths of the Islamic world, was so traumatic to the West that we just erased it from our historical memory. And then it seems to me, Douglas, that something like that is going on right now.
Yes.
I mean, you look, let's talk about the universities for a moment. Now, there's a fair bit of pathology in the universities, a fair bit. It's like top to bottom. They're absolutely incorrigible as far as I'm concerned, especially the Ivy Leagues. They should be ashamed of themselves. They should be deprived of all funding as far as I'm concerned. In any case, the protests that emerged there and all across the world, you detail out, and with some great sadness and amazement. But I think part of it is that it's not within the purview of the people who are protesting to replace their theory that the victims are uprising with the notion that a malevolent cult of death that worships sadistic suffering and annihilation exists. It's too far outside their worldview. Now, there's more to it than that, because Iran is, you saw that the Ayatollah, this is the most amazing thing. The Ayatollah himself congratulated the American universities, or the universities of the UK for that matter, too.
He congratulated the Western students for joining the anti-colonial struggle. Not mentioning to the students that have Ayatollah Khomeini had
colonized Iran.
Their contemporaries across the streets of Tehran in 2009
and
on many other occasions.
Minor issue.
And when Iranian students come out on the streets to protest against the actual oppression of the Islamic Revolutionary government in Tehran, Ayatollah Khomeini, who congratulates the Western students for uprising, shoots the students who uprise in Iran. But that's a detail.
Yes, it's an ignorable detail, clearly. And there's another issue that seems to be operating at the universities. A disproportionate number of the protesters, the protester puppets, you might say, are young women, right? And so there's something to that too, because it's in the nature of young women, I would say, to adopt the mien of sympathy towards victimization and fail to see the predators lurking underneath the rocks, let's say. Women haven't traditionally fought wars. They're not necessarily equipped to identify actual enemies. Their proclivity is sympathy, and that's exacerbated in the case of naivety. And there's a great intermixture of pride in that too. And the female sympathy can, what would you say, overcome the pathology of victimization. That's Eve, as far as I'm concerned, clutching the serpent to her breast. And the universities have become feminized to a great degree. And then there's this incredibly deep, and people overall, I think, in the West have no idea how pathological the universities have become. The social sciences, the humanities run on an oppressor-victim narrative, and everything is seen through that light. And you can learn the tenets of the oppressor-victimizer narrative in 5 minutes, and then you can explain the world.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and by the way, there's a very healthy dose of narcissism thrown into the whole thing, which is that to the extent that any students at American universities get taught anything about the Middle East, they will be taught Edward Said's claim of Orientalism, which of course is a claim that is, by Said's own admission, spilt way beyond even the claims that he made in his book. Said's insight, if you can call it that, was that when Westerners approached the Arab and Muslim world, they did so through the eyes of Westerners, which is an observation so banal that only the Academy could extrapolate out a whole course from it. I mean, what eyes would
Especially especially without giving some due credit to the fact of westernized.
Well, if people like, I mean, when Napoleon goes to Egypt, one of the things he does is to order a massive catalogue of all of the riches and treasures of ancient Egypt, a catalogue which Egypt itself had not produced to that point.
Right.
And one of the people who Napoleon gets on to do this, and who founds the Cairo Museum, by the way, ends up also being one of the people who breaks the code of the Rosetta Stone, giving the lost languages back to the region. But anyway, people don't need to know any of that.
Another detail. Just another detail.
Why do you need to know that when you can say, this is what science really
Westernized who defined ancient artifacts as treasures to begin with.
Right.
Right. Then it becomes self-evident. Right.
But just consider the enormously advantageous aspect of narcissism to this mix, because the narcissistic thing that Said helped to give American and other Western students was nothing in the world happens unless you in the West make it happen. You make it so. The Palestinians, like all the Arabs, the Muslim world, the developing world as a whole, does nothing of its own volition. It can't even make mistakes on its own dime. It's you that made them do it. What did we in America do to cause this? Is the lens, the only lens through which an American student will be taught to look at the world. Why is this happening in China? What did we do to China will be the way, but everything is interpreted. So this is just not fit for purpose for understanding the world, but it's hugely narcissistic because, among other things, I mean, and you can see this in the spilling out of protests to American and other Western campuses. One of the things I say at one point in the book is, what level of delusion and narcissistic delusion do you have to be in to think that you at the University of Columbia or Berkeley or Yale or Princeton or Oxford can dictate war policy 2 continents away? Who was waiting for your opinion exactly?
It's an extension.
In counter-terrorism strategy in densely built-up urban areas. When you say that your university is central to the funding of Israel's war, what do you mean? What do you mean? What, you at your campus is at the center of the war? Really? Really? You're at the center of world events by sitting in the middle of your quadrangle in a tent?
What if I told you there's a tiny nutrient missing from your body that could potentially...
Let me put a twist on that and tell me what you think. So it seems to me that the Pride story is slightly, perhaps, more complicated than the tale that you laid out. So there's this initial presumption of Western centrality, let's say, that you pointed to. But see, one of the things I saw at the University of Toronto shortly before it became impossible for me to work there, was this insistence by my colleagues that there was no moral pathway, no more productive and moral pathway that a student could be invited to take than the pathway of protest.
Yes.
Right. Okay. So now see, it's not only that the students are characterized by this overweening certainty in Western, what would you say?
Dominance and malevolence.
Yes. It's that so they posit this malevolent force that's centered in the West, but then they position themselves as adversaries to that force, and
yes.
that's the prideful twist.
Well,
it's like, we're so horrible here in the West, but I'm so good that even though I'm part of the West, I'll do everything I can to oppose that. And then they're egged on by their idiot professors.
I quote a student at Columbia who described himself as a first-generation low-income student, first in his family to go to university, certainly the first to go to Columbia. You would have thought, most of us would have thought, damn, I'm lucky. Mm-hmm. But he describes how straight away he was taught what he described as the rich history of protest at Columbia, and remembered thinking, when it kicks off again, I want to be at the center of it.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know about you, but I think student days should be used for many things, but the idea that you should make yourself central to the protest movements of your time as your demonstration of virtue and your years of study is, well, that's taught. That's taught. That young man was taught that.
Yes.
It's because
by the culture too.
by the
not
culture.
just by
It's
the
because the professors at totally pointless studies institutes, other things, and sometimes in serious programs, are actually telling their students this. There are a number of former faculty of Columbia that I've spoken to, and some present still, who say this to me. They said, oh, we were teaching this for years. This was all being boiled up by us, by the faculty, for years ahead of this. But the other thing that happens then, just to add to your riff on the sin of it, is that, as you know, one of the conclusions I come to about this is that this has been projection on a vast scale. And it really took talking with quite a lot of psychologists and psychiatrists about this phenomenon in the last 18 months to work this out. There's this rule, as you know, that I go into in the book that I've mulled on a lot, that I got from the great Soviet Jewish writer Vasily Grossman, who appears intermittently throughout the book. And Vasily Grossman had this terrific dictum in the middle of Life and Fate, where he says, tell me what you accuse the Jews of, I'll tell you what you're guilty of. This is unbelievably relevant again and again and again. You know, the Iranian Revolutionary Government says that the Jewish state is a colonialist enterprise. The Iranian Revolutionary Government is colonizing the Middle East since 1979.
But there's nothing colonist about Islam.
Oh, no, I mean,
No, it's only the fastest growing empire in the history of the world.
And as you know, Muhammad, when he spread Islam, only did through by persuasion and kindness.
Right, and that still obtains today. We'll get back to that.
But every time this I mulled on this subject in recent years, the Grossman's rule absolutely applied. People using the Jewish state, just as they have the Jewish people throughout history, as a projection mechanism for their own failings.